In the autumn of 1892, deep in the pine forests of southern Arkansas, a discovery was made that would shake the very foundations of faith and expose the darkest corruption within sacred walls. When authorities finally breached the iron gates of St. Catherine's Convent, they found evidence of 37 women who had entered seeking spiritual salvation, but whose earthly remains told a story of unimaginable horror. The women had come from across the state, drawn by promises of peace, redemption, and divine purpose, but what they found behind those holy walls was something far more sinister than any earthly sin they sought to escape. The rolling hills of Garland County, Arkansas, in 1892 were a landscape caught between the Old South and the emerging modern age. The Civil War had ended nearly 3 decades earlier, but the scars of conflict still marked the land and its people. Small communities dotted the countryside, connected by dusty roads that wound through dense forests of pine and oak. It was in this remote setting that Mother Superior Agatha Blackwood established St. Catherine's Convent in the spring of 1875, purchasing nearly 400 acres of secluded woodland with funds she claimed came from a generous benefactor in New Orleans. The convent presented itself as a sanctuary for women seeking refuge from the harsh realities of post-war America. Mother Agatha advertised in newspapers across Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, offering shelter to widows, unmarried mothers, women fleeing abusive marriages, and anyone seeking spiritual renewal. The message was always the same: St. Catherine's provided a place where women could find peace, purpose, and a new beginning in service to God. The location was deliberately remote, Mother Agatha explained, to provide the isolation necessary for deep spiritual contemplation and to protect the women from the temptations and distractions of the outside world. The nearest town, Pine Ridge, was a modest settlement of perhaps 200 residents located 8 miles from the convent grounds. Most of the townspeople were farmers, loggers, or merchants who served the surrounding rural community. Pine Ridge had a single main street lined with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and a handful of houses. The town's isolation meant that news traveled slowly, and outside authorities rarely visited unless there was serious trouble. Mother Agatha Blackwood was a woman who commanded immediate respect and attention. Tall and imposing, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, she carried herself with an authority that seemed to radiate divine purpose. She claimed to be a former missionary who had served in Africa before returning to America to establish a new religious community. Her knowledge of Scripture was extensive, her devotion appeared absolute, and her vision for St. Catherine's was both inspiring and ambitious. The convent buildings were constructed over several years, with Mother Agatha personally overseeing every detail of the design and construction. The main structure was a 3-story stone building in the Gothic Revival style, with tall windows, pointed arches, and a bell tower that could be seen for miles across the countryside. A chapel occupied the eastern wing, while the western wing housed dormitories, a dining hall, and common areas. Separate buildings included a kitchen, laundry facilities, workshops, and storage areas. What made St. Catherine's unique among religious institutions of the era was its emphasis on complete separation from the outside world. Mother Agatha taught that true spiritual growth could only occur when women freed themselves entirely from worldly concerns and relationships. New residents were encouraged to break all contact with their former lives, including family members, friends, and any connections to their past. This was presented not as a harsh requirement, but as a liberating opportunity to be reborn in Christ. The women who came to St. Catherine's arrived from all walks of life, but they shared common threads of desperation, loss, and the hope for redemption. Sarah Mitchell, a widow from Little Rock whose husband had died in a logging accident, arrived in June 1876 with her 2 young daughters, seeking a place where she could provide them with education and moral guidance. Mary Ellen Watson, an unmarried mother from Memphis, came in August of the same year, hoping to escape the shame and judgment of her hometown. Elizabeth Harper, fleeing an abusive marriage in New Orleans, arrived in September with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desire to disappear completely from her former life. The process of joining St. Catherine's was carefully designed to create both attraction and dependency. Prospective residents were required to write detailed letters explaining their circumstances and their desire for spiritual renewal. Mother Agatha would respond with compassionate, understanding replies that offered hope and promised a new beginning. She would invite them to visit the convent for a period of reflection and prayer, during which they could experience the peace and purpose that awaited them as permanent residents. The initial visits were designed to create a powerful emotional impact. The beauty of the setting, the apparent devotion of the residents, and Mother Agatha's charismatic leadership combined to create an atmosphere that seemed genuinely holy and transformative. Visitors attended prayer services in the stunning chapel, participated in communal meals where residents spoke of their gratitude and spiritual growth, and experienced the deep silence and reflection that pervaded the convent grounds. During these visits, Mother Agatha would conduct private counseling sessions with prospective residents, encouraging them to share their deepest fears, regrets, and desires. She demonstrated a remarkable ability to understand and empathize with their pain, offering biblical wisdom and practical guidance that seemed perfectly tailored to their specific needs. Many women later said that their conversations with Mother Agatha were the first time in their lives that they felt truly understood and accepted. The decision to become a permanent resident of St. Catherine's was presented as a gradual, natural progression rather than a sudden commitment. Mother Agatha would suggest that the woman extend her visit, participate more fully in the community's daily routine, and gradually release her attachments to the outside world. The process was designed to feel empowering rather than controlling, with each step presented as the woman's own choice guided by divine inspiration. New residents were required to donate all their worldly possessions to the convent, keeping only basic personal items and clothing suitable for religious life. Money, jewelry, property deeds, and any other assets were turned over to Mother Agatha for the benefit of the community. This was explained as a biblical requirement for those seeking to follow Christ's example of poverty and service. The women were assured that their material needs would be completely provided for, and that their spiritual growth would be immeasurably enhanced by freedom from worldly concerns. The daily routine at St. Catherine's was structured around prayer, work, and spiritual study. The women rose at 5 in the morning for the first prayer service of the day, followed by a simple breakfast and assignments to various work duties. Some tended the extensive gardens that provided food for the community. Others worked in the kitchens, laundry, or workshops where they produced goods that Mother Agatha claimed were sold to support the convent's operations. The work assignments rotated regularly, ensuring that all residents gained experience in different aspects of community life. This system was presented as a way of developing humility and practical skills, but it also served to prevent any individual from gaining too much knowledge about the convent's operations or developing special relationships with outside contacts who might purchase their products. Meals were communal affairs held in silence or accompanied by readings from scripture or inspirational texts. The food was simple but adequate, consisting mainly of vegetables from the gardens, bread baked on the premises, and occasional meat from animals raised on the convent grounds. Mother Agatha emphasized that physical simplicity was essential for spiritual growth, and that excessive attention to food or comfort was a distraction from divine purpose. The educational program at St. Catherine's was extensive and impressive. Mother Agatha had established a library containing hundreds of books on theology, philosophy, history, and literature. Residents attended daily classes on scripture study, church history, and spiritual development. More advanced students were encouraged to pursue deeper theological studies and to consider their potential calling to formal religious vows. Mother Agatha also provided practical education and skills that would serve the community's needs. Women learned advanced cooking techniques, textile production, herbal medicine, and basic medical care. These skills were presented as valuable contributions to the community's self-sufficiency and as forms of service that honored God. The residents took pride in their growing expertise and in their ability to contribute meaningfully to the community's welfare. The chapel services at St. Catherine's were particularly powerful and moving experiences. Mother Agatha had a remarkable gift for preaching, combining deep biblical knowledge with emotional insight and practical wisdom. Her sermons addressed the specific struggles and fears that had brought the women to the convent, offering hope, forgiveness, and the promise of spiritual transformation. The music was beautiful and uplifting, with residents trained in harmony and accompaniment that created an atmosphere of transcendence and worship. The spiritual counseling provided by Mother Agatha was perhaps the most attractive aspect of life at St. Catherine's. She met privately with each resident on a regular basis, providing guidance, encouragement, and personalized instruction in spiritual growth. These sessions were deeply meaningful to women who had often felt lost, abandoned, or condemned by their circumstances. Mother Agatha's ability to offer both divine forgiveness and practical wisdom created powerful emotional bonds that made residents feel genuinely loved and valued. The isolation of St. Catherine's was carefully maintained through both physical and psychological means. The convent grounds were surrounded by dense forest, with the only access road requiring a difficult 8-mile journey to Pine Ridge. Residents were discouraged from making this journey, both because of its difficulty and because contact with the outside world was considered spiritually harmful. Mother Agatha taught that the secular world was full of temptations, distractions, and negative influences that could undermine the spiritual progress they were making. Communication with the outside world was strictly controlled. Residents were allowed to write letters to family members, but these had to be approved by Mother Agatha, who reviewed them for content that might be spiritually harmful or that might compromise the community's privacy. Similarly, incoming mail was reviewed before being delivered, with Mother Agatha explaining that she needed to protect residents from messages that might cause emotional disturbance or spiritual regression. The few visitors who came to St. Catherine's were carefully managed to maintain the convent's reputation while protecting its secrets. Mother Agatha would meet with visitors in a specially prepared reception area, showing them only the most impressive aspects of the facility and introducing them only to residents who had been carefully coached about what to say. These interactions reinforced the image of St. Catherine's as a legitimate and beneficial religious institution. Mother Agatha's control over information extended to the residents' understanding of the outside world. She provided regular updates about current events, but these were carefully selected and interpreted to support her teachings about the corruption and dangers of secular society. Natural disasters, economic problems, social conflicts, and moral scandals were presented as evidence that the world was becoming increasingly hostile to Christian values and that the residents were blessed to be protected from such influences. The financial operations of St. Catherine's were complex and carefully hidden from both residents and outside observers. Mother Agatha claimed that the convent was supported by donations from wealthy benefactors who wished to remain anonymous, by the sale of products made by the residents, and by the contributions made by new residents when they joined the community. She maintained detailed financial records that showed the convent operating at a modest surplus, with funds carefully managed to ensure the community's long-term stability. In reality, the financial picture was quite different. The assets donated by new residents were not being used for the community's benefit, but were being systematically converted to cash and transferred to accounts controlled by Mother Agatha. The products made by the residents were being sold at much higher prices than reported, with the profits being diverted for personal use. Most disturbing of all, Mother Agatha had been receiving payments from individuals and organizations for services that had nothing to do with legitimate religious activities. The residents of St. Catherine's were unaware of these financial irregularities because they had no access to external financial information and no knowledge of the true value of their labor or contributions. They trusted Mother Agatha completely to manage their material needs and believed that their focus should be on spiritual rather than worldly concerns. This trust was carefully cultivated and maintained through a combination of genuine spiritual guidance and subtle psychological manipulation. As the years passed, St. Catherine's developed a reputation in the surrounding region as a successful and beneficial religious institution. Mother Agatha maintained correspondence with church officials, government authorities, and community leaders, presenting regular reports about the convent's activities and the spiritual growth of its residents. These reports were carefully crafted to reinforce the image of St. Catherine's as a model religious community that was making valuable contributions to society. The success of this deception was aided by the social attitudes of the era toward women and religious institutions. Women who entered convents were expected to disappear from public life, so their absence from their former communities was not considered unusual or suspicious. Religious institutions were generally trusted and respected, with little outside oversight or investigation of their internal operations. The combination of social expectations and institutional respect created an environment where St. Catherine's could operate with minimal external scrutiny. However, beneath the surface of this apparently successful religious community, disturbing patterns were beginning to emerge that would eventually lead to one of the most shocking discoveries in Arkansas's history. The very isolation and control that made St. Catherine's attractive to desperate women also created conditions where abuse and exploitation could flourish unchecked. The trust and dependence that Mother Agatha cultivated in her residents also made them vulnerable to manipulation and harm. The women who entered St. Catherine's seeking salvation and spiritual growth were about to discover that the sanctuary they had found was actually a carefully constructed trap, and that the woman they trusted as their spiritual mother was something far more sinister than they could have imagined. The first signs that something was deeply wrong at St. Catherine's Convent began to surface in the late summer of 1889, though it would take years before anyone recognized these incidents as pieces of a much larger and more horrifying puzzle. The warning signs came not from dramatic revelations, but from small, troubling details that gradually accumulated like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Thomas Bradley, a traveling preacher who served the scattered communities of southern Arkansas, had been making regular visits to Pine Ridge since 1885. During his monthly stops, he would often inquire about the spiritual welfare of the surrounding area, including the activities at St. Catherine's Convent. For years, the townspeople had spoken positively about Mother Agatha's work, praising her dedication to helping unfortunate women find new purpose in life. However, in August 1889, Bradley began to notice subtle changes in these conversations. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who ran the general store in Pine Ridge, mentioned that Mother Agatha's supply orders had become increasingly unusual over the past year. While the convent had always purchased substantial quantities of basic food items, medical supplies, and household necessities, recent orders included large amounts of materials that seemed strange for a religious community. Heavy chains, padlocks, carpenter's tools, and quantities of lime typically used for construction or agricultural purposes were being delivered to the convent with increasing frequency. When Bradley asked about these purchases, Mrs. Patterson explained that Mother Agatha had mentioned expanding the convent's facilities to accommodate more residents and improving their self-sufficiency by developing new workshops and storage areas. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but something about Mother Agatha's manner during recent visits had struck Mrs. Patterson as different. The Mother Superior had always been serious and focused, but lately she seemed nervous, impatient, and reluctant to engage in the friendly conversations that had previously characterized her visits to town. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who provided medical services to the Pine Ridge area, had his own concerns about St. Catherine's. Over the years, he had been called to the convent on several occasions to treat residents who had supposedly suffered accidents or illnesses. However, Dr. Morrison had never been permitted to examine patients directly. Instead, Mother Agatha would describe symptoms in detail and request specific medications or treatments. When the doctor insisted on seeing patients personally, Mother Agatha would explain that the women were too modest to be examined by a male physician, or that they were suffering from conditions that made them unable to receive visitors. Dr. Morrison found these restrictions increasingly suspicious, particularly as the reported injuries and illnesses became more severe and frequent. Mother Agatha had requested treatments for broken bones, severe lacerations, and symptoms that suggested serious malnutrition or abuse. When questioned about the high rate of injuries among the residents, Mother Agatha explained that many of the women arrived at the convent in poor health due to their difficult circumstances, and that accidents were unfortunately common as they learned to perform unfamiliar work duties. The doctor's suspicions were heightened by Mother Agatha's extensive knowledge of medical treatments and her specific requests for medications that could be used for purposes other than healing. She had asked for large quantities of laudanum and other opiates, explaining that many residents suffered from chronic pain due to their hard lives before coming to the convent. She had also requested chemicals and supplies that had no obvious medical application, claiming they were needed for cleaning and maintaining the convent's facilities. Perhaps the most disturbing incident occurred in September 1889, when a young woman named Catherine Mills arrived in Pine Ridge, claiming to have escaped from St. Catherine's Convent. Catherine was in a state of extreme distress, wearing only a thin nightgown despite the cool weather, and bearing obvious signs of physical abuse. Her wrists showed marks consistent with shackles, her body was severely undernourished, and she appeared to be suffering from both physical and psychological trauma. Catherine's story was almost too horrifying to believe. She claimed that St. Catherine's was not a legitimate religious institution, but a prison where women were held against their will and subjected to systematic abuse. According to Catherine, the beautiful chapel services and communal meals that visitors observed were carefully staged performances, with residents forced to participate under threat of severe punishment. The real living conditions at the convent were far different from what outsiders were shown. Catherine described being kept in a basement area beneath the main convent building, where dozens of women were chained in small cells and forced to work in conditions that amounted to slavery. She claimed that Mother Agatha was involved in various criminal activities, including the production of illegal substances, the operation of clandestine medical experiments, and the trafficking of women to buyers in other states. Most shocking of all, Catherine insisted that many women who had entered St. Catherine's over the years had died as a result of abuse, neglect, or deliberate murder. The response to Catherine's allegations was mixed and largely skeptical. Many residents of Pine Ridge found her claims impossible to believe, given Mother Agatha's reputation and the apparently legitimate nature of the convent's operations. Catherine's disheveled appearance and obvious psychological distress led some to conclude that she was suffering from mental illness or delusions. Others suggested that she might be a disgruntled former resident who was exaggerating normal disciplinary measures or misinterpreting the strict religious lifestyle. However, a few individuals took Catherine's allegations seriously enough to warrant investigation. Thomas Bradley, the traveling preacher, was particularly troubled by her account because it helped explain some of the unusual details he had noticed during his visits to the area. Dr. Morrison was also concerned, as Catherine's physical condition was consistent with the types of injuries and illnesses that Mother Agatha had been requesting treatments for over the years. The most significant supporter of Catherine's story was Sheriff Robert Hayes, a veteran law enforcement officer who had served Garland County for over a decade. Sheriff Hayes had developed a reputation for thorough investigation and was not easily swayed by community, opinion, or social pressure. When Catherine approached him with her allegations, he listened carefully and began conducting a discreet inquiry into the activities at St. Catherine's Convent. Sheriff Hayes's initial investigation revealed several troubling inconsistencies in the convent's public image. Official records showed that over the years, dozens of women had been reported as residents of St. Catherine's, but very few had ever been seen leaving the facility or returning to their former communities. While this could be explained by the convent's emphasis on breaking ties with the outside world, the complete absence of any former residents was unusual even for the most isolated religious communities. The sheriff also discovered financial irregularities that raised questions about the convent's operations. Property records showed that Mother Agatha had been acquiring additional land around the convent, paying cash for purchases that should have been beyond the means of a religious community dependent on donations. Bank records, obtained through official channels, revealed large cash deposits and transfers that seemed inconsistent with the convent's reported sources of income. Most disturbing were the reports from families who had lost contact with relatives who had entered St. Catherine's. While the convent's policy of encouraging residents to break ties with their past explained some of this isolation, several families had tried unsuccessfully to make contact with their loved ones. Letters sent to the convent went unanswered, and visits to the facility were discouraged or refused entirely. In some cases, families had been told that their relatives had died from illness, but no bodies had been returned for burial, and no death certificates had been filed with county authorities. Sheriff Hayes decided that a formal investigation was warranted, but he faced significant challenges in gathering evidence about activities within the convent. The facility's remote location and strict isolation made surveillance difficult, and Mother Agatha's reputation in the community meant that any investigation would need to be handled carefully to avoid accusations of religious persecution or harassment of a legitimate charitable institution. The breakthrough that would expose the truth about St. Catherine's came from an unexpected source. In October 1889, a fire broke out in one of the convent's outbuildings, apparently caused by an accident in a workshop where residents were engaged in some type of manufacturing activity. The Pine Ridge Volunteer Fire Department responded to the emergency, providing Sheriff Hayes with the first opportunity for official personnel to observe the convent's operations firsthand. Fire Chief William Thompson and his volunteers arrived at St. Catherine's to find Mother Agatha in a state of extreme agitation that seemed disproportionate to the relatively minor nature of the fire. While the burning building was quickly brought under control, Mother Agatha was insistent that the firefighters leave immediately and refused to allow them to inspect other buildings for fire safety hazards. Her behavior struck the firefighters as suspicious, particularly given the serious safety concerns that the incident had revealed. During their brief time on the convent grounds, several firefighters noticed details that contradicted the facility's public image. The windows on the main building were equipped with heavy bars that appeared designed to keep people inside rather than protect against intruders. The grounds showed evidence of recent construction projects, including what appeared to be the installation of underground facilities that had no obvious purpose for a religious community. Most disturbing were the sounds coming from within the main building, muffled cries and voices that suggested the presence of many more people than were visible. Fire Chief Thompson reported these observations to Sheriff Hayes, who decided that the fire incident provided sufficient justification for a more thorough investigation. He began planning a formal inspection of the convent, working with state authorities to ensure that any legal action would be properly supported and documented. The investigation would need to be conducted carefully, but the accumulating evidence suggested that Catherine Mills's allegations might have been more accurate than anyone had wanted to believe. The sheriff's investigation revealed that Mother Agatha's background was far different from what she had claimed. Records from other states showed that she had been involved in several questionable enterprises before establishing St. Catherine's, including the operation of private medical facilities that had been shut down by authorities and involvement in business ventures that had resulted in financial losses for investors. Her claimed experience as a missionary could not be verified, and there was no record of her having received formal religious training or authorization from any recognized church organization. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation uncovered evidence that Mother Agatha had been in correspondence with individuals involved in criminal activities across multiple states. Letters found in a search of property associated with the convent revealed connections to people engaged in illegal medical practices, the production and distribution of controlled substances, and various forms of human trafficking. The language used in these letters was coded and indirect, but the implications were clear enough to warrant serious concern. As Sheriff Hayes gathered more evidence, he began to understand that St. Catherine's Convent was not an isolated criminal operation, but part of a larger network of illegal activities that extended across state lines. The facility's remote location, religious cover, and population of vulnerable women had made it an ideal base for various criminal enterprises that required secrecy and a steady supply of people who would not be missed by the outside world. Investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods that Mother Agatha had used to maintain her operation's secrecy. The staged tours for visitors, the carefully coached residents who participated in public activities, and the systematic isolation of the facility's true activities were all part of a comprehensive deception that had successfully fooled authorities and community members for over a decade. The religious framework had provided perfect cover for activities that would have been immediately suspicious in any other context. Sheriff Hayes realized that exposing the truth about St. Catherine's would require more than local law enforcement resources. He reached out to federal authorities and began coordinating with officials in other states where similar operations might be functioning. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond a single facility to encompass a network of criminal activities that posed a threat to vulnerable women across the region. The psychological impact of the emerging revelations was profound for everyone involved in the investigation. The idea that a respected religious institution could be a front for systematic abuse and exploitation challenged fundamental assumptions about safety, trust, and moral authority. For the residents of Pine Ridge and the surrounding area, the possibility that they had been living for years next to such horrors was almost impossible to accept. As winter approached in 1889, the investigation into St. Catherine's Convent was reaching a critical point. The accumulated evidence strongly suggested that serious crimes were being committed within the facility, but the challenges of gathering conclusive proof and ensuring the safety of potential victims made any direct action extremely risky. Sheriff Hayes knew that when the truth about St. Catherine's finally emerged, it would shock the region and expose a level of evil that few people could imagine existing behind the walls of a supposedly holy institution. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the full extent of the horrors that had been hidden within St. Catherine's Convent, and the courage of a few determined individuals would soon expose one of the most shocking criminal enterprises in Arkansas's history. The women who had sought sanctuary within those walls were about to discover whether their faith in justice would be rewarded, or whether the forces of evil that had controlled their lives would prove too powerful to overcome. The moment of truth arrived on a cold December morning in 1891, when Sheriff Robert Hayes, accompanied by federal marshals and state investigators, finally obtained the legal authority to conduct a full search of St. Catherine's Convent. Investigation that followed would expose horrors that surpassed even the most disturbing allegations made by Catherine Mills 2 years earlier. What authorities discovered within the sacred walls would forever change how the people of Arkansas understood the capacity for evil to hide behind the mask of religious devotion. The raid began at dawn on December 15, 1891, with law enforcement officers surrounding the convent grounds to prevent anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. Mother Agatha met them at the front door, her composure remarkably calm despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. She presented the search warrant to the officers with dignified resignation, claiming that she welcomed the opportunity to clear up any misunderstandings about the convent's activities. Her confident demeanor suggested either complete innocence or an unshakable belief that her carefully constructed deceptions would protect her even under official scrutiny. Sheriff Hayes and his team began their search in the main building, starting with the areas that were normally shown to visitors. The chapel, dining hall, and common areas appeared exactly as they had during previous visits, clean, well-maintained, and consistent with the image of a legitimate religious institution. However, as the search progressed to areas that were typically off-limits to outsiders, disturbing inconsistencies began to emerge that contradicted everything the public had been told about life at St. Catherine's. The dormitory areas that Mother Agatha claimed housed the convent's residents were largely empty, containing only a few beds and personal belongings that appeared to be maintained for show rather than actual use. The kitchen and dining facilities were equipped to serve far more people than were visible in the main building, suggesting that the convent's population was much larger than what visitors had observed. Most troubling were the discovery of heavy locks and security measures on doors that should have provided free access within a religious community. Federal Marshal James Whitmore, who was leading the investigation, noticed architectural features that seemed designed more for imprisonment than for spiritual contemplation. Windows were equipped with bars that could only be unlocked from the outside. Doors had been reinforced with additional locks and security measures, and ventilation systems had been modified in ways that suggested they were being used to control airflow to specific areas of the building. These modifications had been carefully concealed from casual observation, but close inspection revealed a pattern of construction that was inconsistent with the building's supposed purpose. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered a concealed entrance to underground areas that had never been mentioned in any of the convent's official descriptions. Behind a false wall in what appeared to be a storage room, a narrow staircase led down to a basement complex that extended far beyond the footprint of the building above. The air rising from this hidden area carried odors that immediately alerted the investigators to the presence of human habitation under conditions of extreme neglect and deprivation. What they found in the basement would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. The underground complex consisted of dozens of small cells, each barely large enough for a single person to lie down. The cells were equipped with heavy chains and shackles that showed signs of long use, and the walls bore scratches and markings that clearly indicated desperate attempts to escape. The conditions were appalling, with inadequate ventilation, no proper sanitation facilities, and evidence of severe overcrowding that had persisted for years. In these underground chambers, investigators found 28 women in various states of physical and psychological distress. Ages ranged from teenagers to elderly women in their 60s, all showing signs of prolonged malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological trauma. Many were too weak to stand or speak coherently, while others cowered in terror at the sight of unfamiliar men, apparently conditioned to expect violence from any unexpected encounter. The women were dressed in rags, their bodies bearing scars and injuries that indicated systematic torture and abuse. Dr. Morrison, who had been called to provide immediate medical assistance, later described the scene as the most horrifying thing he had ever witnessed in his medical career. The women showed signs of diseases that resulted from poor nutrition and unsanitary living conditions, injuries that had healed improperly due to lack of medical care, and psychological damage that would require years of treatment to address. Several were so severely malnourished that their lives were in immediate danger, requiring emergency intervention to prevent death from starvation. The most disturbing discovery came in a separate section of the basement complex where investigators found evidence of activities that went far beyond simple imprisonment and abuse. One area had been equipped as a primitive medical laboratory, complete with surgical instruments, chemical apparatus, and detailed records of experiments that had been conducted on the imprisoned women. The records describe procedures that were clearly designed to test the effects of various drugs, toxins, and medical treatments on human subjects who had no ability to consent or resist. Dr. Morrison's examination of these medical records revealed that Mother Agatha had been conducting systematic experiments on the imprisoned women for years, using them as test subjects for procedures that ranged from testing new pharmaceuticals to investigating the effects of various forms of physical and psychological torture. The experiments were documented with scientific precision, including detailed observations of the subjects' responses, survival rates, and long-term effects of different treatments. Another section of the basement had been converted into a manufacturing facility where the imprisoned women were forced to produce goods under conditions that amounted to slavery. The women worked long hours producing textiles, processed foods, and other products that were then sold through legitimate business channels, generating substantial profits that were entirely controlled by Mother Agatha. The working conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to maximize productivity while minimizing costs and maintaining strict control over the workforce. The investigation revealed that the women had been acquired through various means over the 17 years since the convent's establishment. Some had been legitimate seekers of religious sanctuary who had been gradually drawn into the criminal operation through psychological manipulation and physical coercion. Others had been purchased from criminal associates in other states, trafficked specifically to provide labor and subjects for experimentation. Still others had been kidnapped or lured to the convent through false promises of employment or assistance. Sheriff Hayes discovered detailed records that documented the fate of every woman who had entered St. Catherine's over the years. The ledgers showed that over 150 women had been brought to the facility, but only 28 were found alive during the raid. The records indicated that many had died as a result of the medical experiments, others from malnutrition and disease, and some from injuries sustained during punishment or attempted escapes. The bodies had been disposed of in unmarked graves throughout the convent's extensive grounds. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of Mother Agatha's criminal enterprise. The convent had generated enormous profits through multiple illegal activities, including the sale of products made by slave labor, the operation of a clandestine pharmaceutical manufacturing facility, and payments received from individuals and organizations for conducting illegal medical research. The total amount involved was estimated at over $50,000, an enormous sum for the time period that represented years of systematic exploitation and abuse. Federal investigators discovered that St. Catherine's was connected to a network of similar operations across multiple states. Correspondence found in Mother Agatha's private quarters revealed contacts with criminal associates in Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas, all apparently involved in activities related to human trafficking and illegal medical research. The letters discussed the transfer of subjects between facilities, the sharing of experimental results, and the coordination of activities to avoid detection by law enforcement. The investigation also uncovered evidence of corruption that had enabled the criminal enterprise to operate undetected for so long. Several local officials had received payments in exchange for overlooking suspicious activities or providing advance warning of potential investigations. The corruption extended to state level, where officials responsible for oversight of religious institutions had been bribed to avoid conducting thorough inspections of facilities like St. Catherine's. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that Mother Agatha's criminal activities had been supported by wealthy and influential individuals who had provided funding in exchange for access to the experimental subjects and the results of the illegal medical research. The correspondence revealed that several prominent physicians, businessmen, and politicians had been involved in funding and directing the activities at St. Catherine's, viewing the imprisoned women as valuable resources for advancing their own interests. The arrest of Mother Agatha and her immediate associates marked the beginning of legal proceedings that would continue for years as prosecutors worked to bring justice to the victims and expose the full extent of the criminal network. Mother Agatha maintained her innocence throughout the initial proceedings, claiming that she was being persecuted for her religious beliefs and that the evidence against her had been fabricated by enemies who opposed her charitable work. However, as more evidence emerged and survivors began to testify about their experiences, the scope of the crimes became undeniable. The testimony of the rescued women, though painful to hear, provided crucial evidence about the systematic nature of the abuse and the deliberate cruelty that had characterized life within St. Catherine's. Their courage in speaking about their experiences, despite the trauma they had endured, was instrumental in ensuring that justice would ultimately be served. The investigation expanded to include raids on associated facilities in other states, leading to the rescue of additional victims and the arrest of other members of the criminal network. Federal marshals coordinated with local law enforcement across the region to simultaneously strike at multiple locations, preventing the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The coordinated effort represented one of the first major multi-state criminal investigations in American history. The legal proceedings revealed the sophisticated methods that had been used to maintain the criminal enterprise's secrecy and avoid detection. The religious cover had provided perfect protection for activities that would have been immediately suspicious in any other context. The isolation of the facility and the vulnerability of the victims had made detection extremely difficult, while the corruption of local officials had provided additional protection against investigation. The psychological manipulation techniques used by Mother Agatha were particularly sophisticated, involving a combination of religious indoctrination, physical intimidation, and systematic destruction of the victim's sense of identity and self-worth. The women had been conditioned to believe that they deserved their treatment, that the outside world was hostile and dangerous, and that resistance would only result in worse abuse. This psychological control had been so effective that some victims initially resisted rescue efforts, fearing that their situation would only become worse. The medical evidence presented during the trials provided horrifying details about the experiments that had been conducted on the imprisoned women. The procedures had been designed not for any legitimate medical purpose, but to satisfy the scientific curiosity of individuals who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost for advancing their understanding of physiology, pharmacology, and psychology. The experiments had been conducted without any regard for the health or welfare of the subjects, with death considered simply an unfortunate but acceptable outcome. The financial investigation revealed that the criminal enterprise had been extraordinarily profitable, generating wealth that supported not only the operation of St. Catherine's, but also similar facilities in other locations. The money had been invested in legitimate businesses and real estate, creating a financial network that was difficult to trace and that provided additional cover for illegal activities. The profits had also been used to corrupt officials and finance the expansion of the criminal network. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.